What's going on, y'all? KM Best here with a banger off meta deck that put a top 10 of Infinite. I have an interview with that player. His name is Butt. I am joined by Butt. Yes, that is his name. His name is Butt. He is a top 10 ladder gamer, and his most recent foray into the top 10 was with this deck, and that is a really off-meta kind of approach to what a mid-range deck can look like in Marvel Snap, featuring cards that basically nobody else is playing. I've had this on multiple tier lists because A, it's definitely beaten me, and B, it's a sort of approach that is very different to all the other mid-range out there right now that is relying on, you know, Shang-Chi and Hope Summers and all of that stuff. This is doing something completely different. So, first things first, but welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
I'm going to straight-facedly refer to you as Butt the entire rest of the time. That is the, that is the role you took on when you made your in-game username Butt. So that's just what we're gonna have to deal with. Tell me about this deck.
I just like playing off-meta stuff. Pixie came out, and I'm like, can I make Ultron work? That's how this deck started. It was an Ultron deck. Obviously, when I removed Ultron, so for some reason it started to perform better. But I just really wanted to, play around with Pixie. I made a ton of Pixie decks. I think in the last season, that was my most played card in the season recap by like a surprising number of plays. And it's just a lot of fun. I don't think the card is like that good necessarily, but it is a lot of fun. And you can do a lot of cool stuff with it. And the cube equity is great because you really just don't know what comes out of a Pixie deck. It's very hard to predict. The lines are hard to see, and it's good. It's easy to bluff with. Maybe that only really applies at higher ends of the ranks, but it really is something you can get away with because you have to respect the Pixie.
So, what is it that you would say is the best thing this deck is trying to do? Like, I get it. Pixie is a card that has a lot of snap equity, but it feels like a lot of the rest of what this deck does, at least when I play against you, is what really gives it its power. So walk me through the Patriot, Valkyrie, Mockingbird, and of course, Mysterio package.
Yeah, so Valkyrie is the all-star. I mean, that's just hands down the best card in the deck. It gets you the most cubes. It wins you the most games, especially, in an era where there's Red Hulks and all these crazy big cards. It's just the key piece. I don't think this deck performs anywhere near as well without Valkyrie. But then the rest of the Patriot package is all just really solid, and you can win with it even if you don't get Valkyrie, even if you don't get Pixie. If you just go, Squirrel Girl, Mysterio, Patriot is better than Blue Marvel in that case. Mockingbird, Onslaught. I mean, that's a lot of points. It's a lot of points, and it's spread across the board, and it's hard to sort of interact with that unless you run Enchantress, but not a whole lot of people are running that right now.
Right.
Or Rogue, obviously.
Yeah, this deck really strikes me as like a deck that's like very much a reaction to a reaction. And what I mean by that is the metagame is so Shang-Chi centric. So like this deck is like, all right, I have recognized that all the combo decks, Phoenix Force, Hela, whatever, they're all building to not get Shang-Chi'd. So what they're not building to not do is get Valkyried. I can win a Phoenix Force lane. There are 4 Phoenix Forces in that lane. I will win it with a Valkyrie, right? It does not matter what's going on. I will solve these problems with a Valkyrie. And then in order to sort of facilitate that, you have this Pixie Mobius nut draw that is just giving you some free wins.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Valkyrie, it's great into the Shuri Kitties out there. Anything Shuri, really. Shuri Nimrod and Phoenix Force. I just feel so comfortable against Phoenix Force in general, which there's not a lot of decks where you can say that that's true with.
Yeah.
And Mobius is underrated too, with Loki being great again and a lot of, Mockingbird mirrors or, the Zoo decks that run it. I mean, it's great into it. Back when Death was very popular and discards were popular, even just making a Death brick and Swarms not be playable, or you have to actually play them out. I mean, that's how you beat Destroy, and that's how you beat Discard. So it's a key part of the deck as well.
So I'm going to throw some matchups at you Describe to me how you approach them. Let's say in the absence of the nut draw. We're not Pixie Mobiusing these matchups, but you know, if that's what it has to be, if like we're so unfavored that that's our only plan, sure. But I'm just gonna throw some matchups at you and tell me how you approach them. Silky Smooth.
I mean, Valkyrie, that's generally a pretty favorable matchup for this deck. You can go pretty wide, and usually Silky Smooth is going to build up your Angela lane. If you have Valkyrie, you can, throw Prio, which this deck's very good at doing against most decks. Maybe not against Hela, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. But generally, you're not putting a lot of visible power on the side lanes. It's like you have your Squirrel Girl. Maybe you have your Mysterios that are 2 power because of your Patriot, or 3 if you have the Blue Marvel out. But generally, you're pretty good at throwing Prio, which makes your Valk really powerful. And just going wide, it makes it fairly generally pretty good. If Silky Smooth gets the nut, maybe you really need an Onslaught on a Blue Marvel Patriot lane to really be able to do it. But in general, you're pretty good.
Okay, so matchup number 2, Loki.
Loki is sometimes feels like a hard counter to Loki unless Tanjo or Woody are playing it. And even then, I think I've given Woody some emotional damage.
I'm a little bit offended that you didn't put me in that category, given I 8-cubed you with Loki, but no, I think you are favored into Loki with this for sure.
I also just meant Tanjo's got a magic rogue that just always hits the Mobius. It's like ridiculous. So that's how you like right now. A lot of people aren't really running Rogue and Mobius or in Loki, but that's the scariest card when you do face the Loki. And you kind of just play get down, Mr. President. You throw out Ant-Man, you throw out your Dazzler, and you try to guard your Mobius and make them get lucky. If you have Mobius out, the Loki playing Loki into this deck, you don't really get good cards that are very playable. Like, great, you got a Squirrel Girl. Maybe you can play, the Blue Marvel is generally pretty good, but it's like usually you want to be playing these cards early. You don't want to be playing them late. And great, they have your Valkyrie. What's the Valkyrie going to do against you? Like, it just doesn't really affect this deck besides maybe Mockingbird.
Yeah, as someone who's played a lot of Loki into this deck, I do think it does feel a little bit like a hard counter. It's a deck that just naturally runs Mobius and naturally has a bunch of finicky stuff in it. And generally speaking, like when I played Loki, I felt like the best card I could get from a Loki was your Mobius. Because it's like
counter the Pixie. Yeah, and even then,
or the Mockingbird, right? Like it's like
or the Mockingbird. Yeah, and absolutely. Yeah, I just think but even then, it's like you want your Pixie values early. Like you almost want to play out a lot of your discounted cards early. I think when I first started this deck, it was when Thanos Mobius was really popular. So I think in general, I'd play on curve much more than I would on with any other deck. So even into the Loki mirror, it's turn 5 Mobius. That's not a huge deal because I've usually already played my Onslaught, which is the thing that's the most important thing to get Pixied, right? Like the whole value of Pixie is if you can cheat out that Onslaught early or just discount it. I mean, it does so much value.
One of the other things that I think we've already covered in this deck is the amount of matchups Valkyrie is carrying. So let's talk about one of those, which is Phoenix Force. What's the plan in Phoenix Force? Is it actually just, let's just stack 2 lanes, one of them Valkyrie's going to win, the other one all our big stuff goes in? That's the plan?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you feel pretty good about either of the PFs, the Phoenix Force, winning lines. Sometimes, obviously you can't always catch up to the multiple man going crazy. And if it's a Human Torch, then maybe sometimes it's a guessing game, but then you can go wide unless they're a Tribunal gamer. So even then, you're not feeling too good, or not feeling too bad. When they do the Nimrod, the Shuri Nimrod stuff, that's free. That's a free win as long as you have the Valkyrie. It's just it's telegraphed. Obviously, it's a Shuri. They really can't get any power once you make that a 3-power Nimrod. It just hard counters it essentially.
What about Hela? I think Phoenix Force and Hela occupy roughly similar spots, but Hela's upside has always been you can't interact with me. I refuse to let you do it.
Hela's really tough. I think Hela is one of the harder matchups. If they're a good Hela player, if they're playing into one lane so that there's no way that you can realistically not have prio, you're kind of in trouble because Valk's not really doing a whole lot in that case, right? Because they're getting all their power after you would have theoretically Valked. But that's kind of the key to success there. Either you nut draw with Onslaught and you go crazy with Onslaught, or you have to give up prio and you have to Valk, but you have to also still have enough power to win the second lane, and that can be very, very tough. So I think in general, Hela is one of the hardest matchups for this.
That makes sense. Are there any other matchups you want to shout out as particularly easy or particularly hard?
Living Tribunal is almost unbeatable. Valkyrie's useless. The ones that
I'd love to give my opponent a 3-power Iron Man. That sounds awesome. They love that.
And if it's one of the ones that run scroll, it's just like, okay, what are we even doing here? Mobius can do some work there if you stop the Sarah or the Ravona or Zabu, RIP Zabu. But in general, you're probably losing to a Tribunal deck. Other ones that I think Short Kitty is usually pretty easy. I think that one, again, anything with Shuri, it's just so telegraphed. As long as you can manage prio well, you usually can come out ahead. And they're usually trying to win big in 2 lanes. They're not really, spreading wide. So as long as you Valk 1, you're totally fine. Destroy is like weirdly not a counter. I think it was for a while. I had to adjust my play style when Destroy was very popular. I used to be playing out the Squirrel Girl on turn 1 or the Ant-Man on turn 1. When Destroy is kind of popular, you just need to sort of readjust. And, at the top 100 or whatever, you're playing the same people, so you know what everyone's playing. And if someone's playing Destroy, you just kind of, you don't play on curve unless it's your Mysterio. But, Valk does a lot of work. Mobius does a lot of work. You usually end up okay against Destroy.
So in terms of positioning, the deck you're describing sounds like it's pretty solid into a lot of stuff as long as you are reasonably drawing Valkyrie, right? What about how much of those matchups is just Valk carrying, right? Like a lot of those matchups, it feels like she's the card that comes up all the time, and it's like this is necessary, it's got to happen. How common is that? How necessary is that? Does your Pixie Mobius nut draw win those matchups ever, or is it really just like about her?
No, I mean you win without Valk as well. Like especially with the if you get the Pixie Mobius nut draw, it's just ridiculous sometimes. I mean, if you can get a lane where you got your Onslaught paired with your Blue Marvel or your Patriot, and then one of your lane stacking power cards like your Ant-Man or your Dazzler giving you win that lane, you have +8, basically to the 2 others generally. You can do pretty good stuff with that. Even if you don't get the Pixie nut draw, if you have a good curve, minus Valkyrie, you can still put a lot of power on the board and you're spread pretty wide. It's just a little more countable and telegraphed. So you're not as favored then. I think people generally, like one of the things I love about this deck is how hard it is to really know where I'm going to put my power and how much that power will be. If you don't have the Pixie and you don't have the Valk, you kind of lose that. It's pretty clear, what your game plan is. Like you telegraph to, I'm going to do this. I'm stacking an ongoing lane. It's probably going to be an Onslaught. Maybe I'll have a Mockingbird go down there. But one of the things that I think is not quite as good about Mockingbird in this deck compared to others is you're not usually getting a 0/9 Mockingbird. Which means if you're playing your Blue Marvel on 5 or your Valk on 5 and your Onslaught on 6, you may not be able to play out that Mockingbird. It's not like Thanos or even some other Mockingbird decks where it's almost always a 0/9. It's usually a 2 or 3/9. That's kind of what you're hoping for in most cases.
Wasp's secret power is that she gets things done. What things is she getting done in this deck?
Biggest Valk things, 2 big things. One, if you do play Pixie, it's always great to have a 0 cost in your deck. But really, one of your most common turns with this deck is going to be Valkyrie, or turn 6s is Valkyrie, Wasp, and either Ant-Man or Squirrel Girl. And that, playing all of those cards, you can kind of go wide, you can counter a lane, you can do a lot. And Valkyrie, especially with Wasp, and Patriot out, that's a 0.5. Blue Marvel 0.6. I mean, it does some really good work. You're usually only playing this on 6, unless there's a really good reason not to. But even then, you have your Dazzler, you have your Blue Marvel, you have your Patriot. You like cards on the board in general, and Ant-Man. So you do want to fill lanes. Having a free card is great at doing that.
You mentioned Ant-Man in the same conversation as Dazzler earlier, where it's just like, this is the guy you stick in an onslaught lane and make like relatively large. Is that really mostly what he's doing? Like, I do get that you're filling up a lot of lanes with Ant-Man, you're filling up a lot of lanes with Dazzler, they're the same, right? Does costing one offset the higher potential scaling of Dazzler? Which would you say is more important?
I would say Ant-Man is more important than Dazzler, but I think they're the 11th and 12th cards in this deck. I think they're the least important cards. They're good for Pixie because they cost nothing. And yes, they are decent in the onslaught lane, although they only buff that lane. And so that's not your favorite cards for onslaught. And that's usually not what you're hoping for, unless you need a 1-drop to pair with your Valkyrie. I think they're the 11th and 12th cards in the deck, really.
They do scale very well in a Valkyrie lane on their own, though, right? Like
yes,
Ant-Man Valkyrie, Dazzler in a Valkyrie lane, that kind of stuff happens. It's just you also have, Blue Marvel for your Valkyrie lane, Patriot for you have, there's a lot of redundancy in that, so I can understand why these would be, 11 and 12.
Yeah, you don't need too much. You just need one usually. You need 1 or 2 scalers to win the Valkyrie lane, because usually other decks don't have anything. So if you have 1 Blue Marvel buff, if you have 1 Patriot buff, if you have Ant-Man, if you have Dazzler, any of those usually do it. So you don't really need to go too tall. You don't need to double dip in general. Sometimes you're playing against other Ant-Mans. Zook is occasionally there. Or other things that have buffs in some way that Valkyrie doesn't touch. But usually that's not too common. Usually your Valkyrie's making everything 12 on the opponent's location. So then it becomes, can you beat 12? And you only really need one of those to do that in general.
Squirrel Girl is a card that I think has seen probably more play recently than ever before, thanks to Mockingbird. Here's my question, though. Would you be playing Squirrel Girl even if you were not playing Mockingbird?
Yeah. This deck started before Mockingbird came out. I switched to a different Pixie deck. I made a bunch of Pixie decks, but when Mockingbird came out, I mean, again, I started off with this being an Ultron deck, which was mostly for the memes. But obviously, it seemed like a natural fit for Mockingbird, and that definitely took the deck to the next level. But I was playing this with, Squirrel Girl before Mockingbird, so I don't think Mockingbird is mandatory to be using Squirrel Girl, or even to really be playing this deck. I think it's great. It's an absolutely fantastic card, but I don't think it's required.
All right, let's talk about Pixie. I think there's a million questions I could ask, but the basic one seems like the most important. Are you playing this card when you don't have Mobius?
Yeah, totally, absolutely. I think it depends on what your hand is, obviously. But I would say more often than not, I am playing it without Mobius. Of course, I'm hoping to draw Mobius. But usually it's like you still, because of the high roll and the bluff potential, I think it's still worth playing. If you think maybe your opponent's running a deck that has Mobius, you're never playing Pixie. If you don't have it, if you do, you still do it, because what happens is you play Pixie, they bluff, you play Mobius, they play Mobius. Now you've bought their bluff for basically no value, which is great. Bought their snap. That's great. That's always a good thing. When you get them to their snap condition sort of nullified, you still may lose the game, but in general, that's good expected value. But I think Pixie's a lot of fun. I think that's one of the reasons I'm playing this deck. So I want to play it when I can. But usually, yeah, I would play it even without Mobius.
You have sort of implied throughout the course of this interview that this is the worst card in the deck. Are there any cards you strongly considered replacing her with?
For a while, I teched in Rogue for Dazzler. I think it's worse with Rogue, but it was, hey, let's Rogue their Mobius, or let's Rogue the Rogue that rogued my Mobius. I think Dazzler is great. It just is a little more awkward sometimes if you don't get it early, and you don't have all your your Mysterios and your Squirrel Girls out. Sometimes you're not filling every lane, and then it's a it's a 2-4, it's a 2-6. It's still good, but it's not going to win you the game in those cases a lot of the time. So yeah, I think that's the 12th card in the deck for sure.
Have you considered that she has dope ass hair though? And I'm not just saying that because it kind of looks like my hair. I am just saying that because it kind of looks like my hair.
Yeah. No, I mean, and I have the Dazzler variant that is very pretty. So I
you have
like
the art germ Dazzler variant. You have the photorealistic Dazzler. Yeah, we all know what this man is about.
Yeah, exactly. So you got to rock that one when you can. Why it's still on the deck, right?
Mysterio giving Mockingbird a 3 discount is, I think, like one of the more underrated interactions in a deck like this, because this is a deck that loves to just play a Mysterio on turn 2. It loves it, right? Because like you're just you're so good with everything that comes out of that. You love not having priority and putting points on the board at the same time. And Mysterio accomplishes just like all of those goals, discounts your Mockingbird. You are absolutely curving out a Mysterio most of the time. And being able to just like do that and have the discount Mockingbird in a deck that doesn't get hyper punished for it, right? Like it's not like you're also playing Brood. It's not like you're risking necessarily clogging a lane. With Mysterio and with Squirrel Girl, you have great ability to fill lanes up, but you have a lot of control over whether or not they get clogged or not. And that is, I think, something that's really important. So my question to you is, are there any scenarios where you are not playing Mysterio on 2 that do not involve playing Pixie on 2?
Yes. Well, I would usually play Dazzler on 2 before I would play Mysterio on 2,
Okay.
because of unrevealed locations. But if I have Mockingbird in my hand, maybe not. Pixie is always play on 2 in general, unless it's like you have, one of the 2 locations that's revealed is something I can't get into. Then you kind of need the board space, so you maybe hold the Pixie at that point. But in general, I will always play Mysterio on curve if Dazzler's not or Pixie are not in my hand. And yeah, I mean, I love Mysterio. It's better than Squirrel Girl in this deck, although it's close. But
you really think it's close?
I think it's close.
Wow.
Yeah, I think it's close. Yeah. And the biggest reason is I think, the fact that it gives you an extra tick on Mockingbird is good, but just being able to play Squirrel Girl with Valkyrie is just so good.
Gotcha.
So I think that really is the differentiator. I mean, if it's before turn 6 and you have the choice, you want to go Mysterio for sure. Yeah. But I mean, in general, that's just such a strong turn 6 play is Squirrel Girl, Wasp, Valkyrie. And yeah, both Squirrel Girl and Mysterio basically turn into discount Dr. Doom. So Dr. Doom's a great card. If you get your buff cards down, these can even get higher. Like sometimes with Onslaught, if you get an Onslaught, Blue Marvel, Patriot lane, these are 2/9s. Well, each one is like a 2/9, and it's just nuts. So it gets a lot of fun, for sure.
The Patriot stuff is like kind of an underrated part of this deck, I think. Like the easiest way for me to conceive of this deck is it's a Patriot deck with Pixie Mobius stapled on, right? Like that's sort of how I look at it. But I think when most people look at this deck, they look at it, it's a Pixie Mobius deck with Patriot stapled on. Yeah. Talk me through like what the Patriot stuff is doing in here and how it synergizes.
Yeah, I mean, really, you could play this deck with Hope instead of Pixie, and I think it would do pretty solidly. Like, you just want to cheat out the Onslaught, basically. I don't think it would be as good, at least in my opinion. But yeah, Patriot's the key buff card in this deck. It's usually actually doing more for you than Blue Marvel, just because so many of your cards are hit by it, and it's twice the value for those cards. And that's kind of how you're winning lanes, right? It's cheaper, so it's one of your 3 drops you can get out there. That's always good. And even though it's only 1 power, you just Valk it and you're good. It's a great thing. Usually you want to have an idea of what lanes you want to Valk early, and I'd always like to play Patriot in that unless I'm stacking an ongoing lane. So it's got a lot of value in this deck. I think it's probably one of the key cards.
How much exactly do you hate Loki to be running like a deck that just main decks Mobius? Doesn't even think of it as a tech card. It's just like, I'm the Mobius gamer. Get out of here, Loki. One of the crazier things about it, though, the bug with Rogue and Mobius, right? Where, like, I don't know if they fixed it in the patch. I haven't run into it yet because it's just something that doesn't happen very much anymore. But currently, as of the time of recording, they just did the patch, right? And I don't know if they fixed it. I haven't run into it. Have you run into it? Hasn't come up yet.
You're talking about where it always hits what Mobius no matter what?
No, solid gag. But the gag, like, I don't know if you know this. If you're a Loki player and you play the card Loki and then you rogue a Mobius, the Mobius doesn't stop working on your Loki cards.
No, I had no idea.
Yeah.
Well, that's well,
messed up.
I hate
right?
Loki. So
yeah,
I played Loki on patch day, and then I've played it in an Agatha deck, and that's it. So or not patch day, on when it was released. No, but I mean, like, you do you. I don't care if players play Loki. I just don't like doing it myself. Right. The Mobius is it's great to have as something to shake up Loki, but really it's there because it's Pixie, right?
Yeah.
I think one of the misconceptions in general about Pixie is you always need to play Mobius with Pixie. I don't think that's true. I think it's true in this deck, but like Husky Puppies made a great Annihilus Pixie deck, and all the low cost cards are cards you never want to play later in the game. So if they cost 5, who cares? You play them on curve, and if you don't, then so what? You don't need Mobius. But in this deck, I do think it's important because you're getting a lot of power out of your low-cost cards. And yeah, it's great that it disrupts other decks as well. That's just a side benefit, even though it ends up kind of being the main benefit.
Blue Marvel has been putting in work in like Zoo Patriot style decks, so it's no shocker to find him here. Does he ever do anything unexpected, or does he play kind of exactly like how you'd think?
Plays pretty much exactly like you think. I'm trying to think of anything crazy. I can't really think of anything. I mean,
yeah, you pretty much just jam him out there when you can, and it's like, oh, that guy's great.
Yeah, I mean, Blue Marvel is like one of those starter cards, right? So everyone knows what it does. It's been in a lot of decks. It's a very solid card. But yeah, it's going to be interesting. This patch just happened, and maybe Lady Deathstrike is somewhat relevant. I doubt it, but that was the scary part, right? Is this deck would die to Lady Deathstrike. Whether it's Blue Marvel, whether it's your Mysterios in general, clones or not, Squirrel Girls, Patriot. I don't know if LDS becomes relevant, but that's a scary thought for this deck specifically.
I don't know if I'm stretching it to say Valkyrie is the best card in the deck, but I do think that the deck would not exist without her. Like, yeah, I think Valkyrie, that, like, yeah. the comparative value of this deck is that it can play into both the Silky Smooth decks and at least one, if not two, of the major combo decks, right? Like, better than those decks can. And almost all of that is on her, right? Like, she is pulling that weight.
Absolutely. I mean, Valkyrie is the best card in the deck, hands down. It's one of my favorite Marvel Snap cards. I've played it in a lot of different decks. I think it's underrated. I think it's starting to become more sort of normally rated, but I just think it's so good. I mean, everyone generally tends to rely on Shang to, disrupt big cards, but, as armors are more prevalent, Luke Cage is bad, but that's another deck that is really...
You're afraid of that too? Yeah.
Yeah. Oh man, those toxic Surfer decks. First of all, you're playing so many cards, all your board just gets super negative, and then Luke Cage counters Valk. But in general, Valk is just a surprising card. I think even people who at High Infinite who I play a bunch, right? Like we all talk, and I'll still get messages like, I can't believe I forgot about Valkyrie. Like that's not a card people think about a lot, even when people know my deck at this point and they know I run Valk, and that's usually how I'm winning games. I just think it's not, people aren't really trained to think about it that much.
She has some solid synergy here, right? Like Mockingbird, great with Squirrel Girl, great with Mysterio, but she doesn't go with literally anything else the deck is doing, right? Like it's literally just, you never get her to 1, so she's never playable alongside a Valkyrie on the final turn of the game. She doesn't get any buffs from Patriot. Blue Marvel actually puts her to 10, which gets her Shang-Chi all the time. There's actually nothing that she does that synergizes with this deck beyond those 2 cards. She's just good enough to run anyway.
Exactly. And one thing you didn't even mention, she's bad with Pixie.
Oh yeah.
Because you're treating this like a lower cost card, right?
Yeah.
But Pixie will swap her as a 5 cost, and that's bad, right? You know, really she's operating as a 3/9 in general, sometimes a 2/9. But in my head, I'm, you know, pessimistic. I count her as a 3/9, but that's not what Pixie sees her as. So, she does have like some weird anti-synergy with parts of the deck, but she's such a good card that she's still part of it. You definitely have to include her. I think half the reason I think this deck works is you can use her to go tall, and if you do, sometimes if you can get it down to 1, you know, there's some kind of random token on the board that gives you the 1 extra bump to get her to a 1. Even if it's like a Devil Dinosaur lane, you could still win that with Valk because you have Valk and then Mockingbird, and like no one's expecting that. It's just a really, really solid card.
Yeah, like you can get her to 0 with both Squirrel Girl and Mysterio, but you're running a lot of risks doing that early, and so you end up in a situation where like very often she's just like only synergizing with literally 1 card at the time, and it's just like, you know what, it's worth it to have a 2/9.
Yeah, you don't. So that's an interesting point you bring up. It's one of the toughest decisions is in this deck is around. Okay, I have Mysterio out. I have Squirrel Girl out. Do I play the other one early? And oftentimes the answer is yes, but you do it like you don't really love doing it.
You're limping it. Because it's one of your limping lines.
Yeah, and because it ruins Onslaught. Like, yeah, great. Your Onslaught can buff 1 thing now. And you just don't have that much space. But at the same time, it still usually works out okay. And yeah, your Mockingbird is free, which is great. So that's always fun.
You mentioned earlier that like maybe you could replace, you know, the Pixie package with Hope Summers because what really matters is getting Onslaught out. And in the service of getting Onslaught out, is he really like the key card in this deck? Because my instinct when I look at this is like, what if I could make the deck smaller, more compact, more consistent, rely on Valkyrie more? If I do that, I'm just giving up too much if I try to cut Onslaught.
So Onslaught is your backup plan if you don't have Valk. Like you're usually winning with Valk over. I mean, like actually, your first plan is Pixie play everything, but Onslaught is not usually your main goal, but it's always good to cheat it out early. I mean, even just an Onslaught Blue Marvel is 8 power in a filled lane, which is just insane. And I agree. Like I would rather essentially go with the Valk line, but you don't always draw Valk. And so in those cases, that's kind of where you want your Onslaught. Because you can't play a 1-drop with your Onslaught if you don't have Pixie value, unless there's some crazy board some location on the table, or it's 7-turn game. And you're usually you want to be playing a 1-drop on 6 with another card. Whether that's Valkyrie, whether that's Mockingbird, whether it's Blue Marvel. Onslaught Wasp is not always the greatest turn 6 play, but sometimes it is. Sometimes it's great. In general, though.
All right, that was a fairly comprehensive review. I'm pretty sure this video is actually longer than others of its type, so very, very, a lot of information, very information dense. Is there anything you want to throw on at the back end for people who might want to be picking this deck up? I know you've been in my chat and you've been like surprised to see people playing this deck against me, and it's like a thing that happens sometimes again, right? Like you're going to see this places, so there's going to be people picking this up. What advice would you give them?
I guess sort of tangential to that question is one of the questions I get about this deck a lot is why not Brood? I did kind of want to touch on that.
Sure.
I think you can go the Brood line. I think the Brood line is worse. I think you're sort of saying this is where my power is going. Your curve isn't anywhere near as good. Brood costs 3. You're not necessarily getting the Mockingbird value, because if you're playing Brood on 3 and you're trying to do Absman, it's like, okay, if you get both of those, yeah, maybe it's now 1 cost, but you wanted to Blue Marvel on 5, like maybe then you can Valk Valk Mockingbird on 6. But I just don't think it plays as well. I think the curve is way more awkward, and I really like that because this deck kind of goes wide. You can kind of determine on turn 6 where your power really is. And you can't
Yeah.
play Mysterio. You can't play Mysterio if you're playing Brood. It like
Right.
just filling the lane by 3. It's just never really gonna pay off.
I think a lot of the power of this deck also relies on Valkyrie. And if you fill up those
Yeah,
lanes early, you're just saying, hey, I'm not going to Valk you here. And that's
yeah,
just like kind of devastating a lot of the time.
right. Exactly. It's a free sort of. If they want to Shuri, that's where they Shuri. You can't do anything about it because it's filled. It's completely full. So yeah, I you can try Brood. I don't think it's as good. Just general tips and I would give. I think always be cognizant of Valk lanes. So like for instance, I was talking earlier how you usually win a game by a Valk lane by having at least one buff. Well, default Squirrel Girl and default Mysterio, like the non-clone, don't get buffs from Patriot in a Valk lane. So you need to be aware of that and plan ahead. Essentially, I used to always never put my main Squirrel in the same lane as the main Mysterio, and then other top 500 people kind of started like I had someone message me. He's like, "Oh, I knew your real one was in this lane because you played the
Yeah.
main Squirrel over here and Mockingbird over here." And I was like, "Ugh, like now I got to mix stuff up." But like as a good rule, that's generally a good rule of thumb because then you're free to Valk any lane without any real punishment. Yeah, that. I would say that's probably it. And then yeah, Pixie's fun. It's gonna brick. It's gonna brick sometimes, but you can snap on it and bluff if you like bluffing, which I do. Um, and it's a lot of people compare it to Mr. Negative, and I think the difference between Pixie and Mr. Negative is like you usually know what's coming when someone plays Mr. Negative, and if you see Mr. Negative and then you see Jane Foster, you just leave. But with Pixie, it's like vague enough that you don't always like you can people stay
It's the
against
Hella
Pixie.
effect where it's like, I
Yeah,
could win this.
right, exactly. So you have no idea what's in their hand. Whereas
Mhm.
like with Mr. Negative, it's like okay, it's an Iron Man, it's a Zola, it's a Null, like whatever. That's why I think Pixie's good. I mean I don't know if she's amazing, but I think she's fun. I think she's a solid card.
All right. Do you have anything you want to promote? Anyone you want to shout out? Or do you want to like promote yourself? Do you want to be like, here's where you can find me? Or do you just want to be like, I'm going to fade back into the ether of like top 10 gaming?
I'll fade back into the ether. I don't have any like Twitter or any like I'm not a creator or anything like that. I'm just like making dumb decks. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, congratulations on making a dumb deck and taking it as high as you can. I hope my audience loves this as much as I have. And I do feel, for the sake of the audience, I'm going to say this. He's 2 years older than me, okay? Just 2 years older than me. Don't you dare. If I catch anyone in the comments talking about it, because I don't know if you know this, audience. I bet you do. I'm going gray too, okay? I'm slowly morphing into rogue. So I will be self-conscious if I catch any of you like doing like going gray shaming, okay? I will.